Yo, what is going on, everyone? I'm back with another review video. It is going to be on the PureTrak Valor. Definitely one of the more surprising mice. I actually thought that this was going to be a very mid mouse, but I actually did have a ton of fun with it. And as per the usual, the comparisons in shape will be much later in the video, so I want to first briefly just talk about the mouse feet itself. And as you can see with the mouse feet themselves, you can see that they are massive feet, and normally that comes with a lot of extra friction, especially depending on the type of pad you are using. It will either feel less or more dense the mouse itself, which is a really weird kind of like experience that I actually had. If I was using anything like the Saturn Pro or really any cloth control surface, it felt much more dense than 63 grams, mainly because it was just a lot harder to move around, especially freely. It just didn't feel as good as the mouse could have felt if I was using something like a textured pad. Literally any type of textured surface, it felt really good. The initial and dynamic friction felt really consistent and really nice on any textured pad, even on something that like an Aqua Control Zero, which is a control pad, but it is a very textured surface, so it actually felt a lot better on this pad. And then what was really interesting is I don't feel like it retained a whole lot of stopping power, as you kind of would expect with larger feet like this, but the edges are also incredibly rounded and they feel really amazing. The next thing I want to talk about are the mouse clicks. These feel amazing. I am actually genuinely really impressed with how PureTrak actually did the click itself, mainly because I've noticed that companies just have really bad implementation, especially with Kale 8.0s. Typically, these feel terrible. In all honesty, I think I've seen more companies do KO 8.0s much more poorly than PureTrak has. The one thing I absolutely would suggest doing is going into the software itself and just changing the debounce, because on default, these are actually at 12 milliseconds, if I remember correctly. So I changed mine down to 2, mainly because I have heard too many issues with going at 0 milliseconds. I've heard tons of double click issues, so typically I never do that on mice anymore. The other nice things about these clicks here is you can see that there are very slight comfort grooves, and there is actually a good bit of pulse travel, but it is all good pre and post travel in my opinion. It does add that extra like snap back when you're clicking in and it's snapping back up, so these do feel very premium, even on something that is supposed to be $120 normally, but I think it's still running for $100 right now. The main thing I like about these comfort grooves is they're not as aggressive as an MZ1 or even like a ZA13. The reason I do think that these slightly less aggressive comfort grooves are better for the mass majority of people is just because you're able to still retain that stability. When using comfort grooves, your fingers will stay locked in place, but because they're not as aggressive, you can still freely move your fingers around to find your sweet spot. Something that I thought would actually be a lot worse is actually the battery life, and I was very surprised with this, mainly because the RGB is only on when the mouse isn't moving, and it reminds me a lot of the Aerox 3 from SteelSeries. The one thing is, in the software, I did take it off just to see the difference between it being on and off, even though every time I turned off my computer and I turned it back on, the RGB would always just come back on for some reason, even if I saved it as off in the settings. So I pretty much just gave up turning it off completely, and even with the battery, so I pretty much just completely gave up turning the RGB off, but even with it on, the battery did actually impress me. I think it lasted around a week of very heavy use, and I used this mouse only for that week period of time, and it only dawned on me once so far, so I am very impressed with the battery life in all honesty. Usually with any wireless RGB mouse, even though the illumination is very dim, only around the back here, like that loose out end shape that I actually did just review in my last video. However, I usually always want it off just to get the maximum I can out of the battery life. These side buttons themselves are really nothing too noteworthy in my opinion. They're definitely more tactile than the GPX side buttons, but they don't feel anything like an XM1R or even an Lamzu Atlantis. So I would like to see better implementation of these side buttons in all honesty, but it's really not that big of a deal since I don't really use side buttons at all. However, something that I do use quite a bit is actually the scroll wheel, and I really enjoy this scroll wheel. It definitely feels better than the GPX in my opinion, mainly because it is much quieter, which I thought was kind of interesting, and it's also more tactile and slightly heavier than a GPX scroll wheel. However, the click in feeling is so much softer, and I really like that. The weight, like I stated earlier, is 63 grams. How it feels much more dense than I had initially expected. I definitely feel like 60 grams should be on the lighter side, especially for a larger mouse. Normally, smaller mice weighing at 60 grams typically feels much more dense than it should, and it feels a lot heavier than 60 grams. And normally, it's the polar opposite on a bigger shell with 60 grams. So I am kind of surprised that this does feel a little bit dense, and that was my only disappointment with this mouse, is I really wanted it to feel a lot lighter than it does. However, the coating is incredibly nice. Even when sweating a lot, it stays incredibly grippy, and I'm able to get a consistent, nice, stable grip every single time I use this mouse. The other thing too is the back shells that they add. They add 4 back shells, 2 are with holes, and 1 is the same like this where it's solid, but it is much flatter. I definitely prefer the one with more palm contact. When I did use the one with less, it felt too slippery. Like I could not get a really nice stable grip on it. It was constantly slipping around in my hand, and that is just because I am a claw gripper, so I do need that back support just so I can stabilize my grip. I also just refuse to use the back with holes, mainly because I wanted to appreciate this coating, because I am genuinely impressed with it. And the last thing I want to touch base on is the shape itself. Obviously, it's going to mostly resemble closest to a GPX. You can see it side by side here. You can tell that it definitely is very heavily inspired by the GPX. However, there are 2 main key differences. Well, I guess 3 if you count the mouse feet, but 2 main differences that really does make it much better than the original GPX shape, in my opinion. The biggest thing is you can see right over here, the GPX is going to have a slightly curved lip. And while I never noticed this bottom lip portion, it was actually Rap, a good friend of mine, that did notice it because he fingertips this mouse. So he noticed that when he went to the bottom, it would actually catch on his finger. But because the Valor does not have that issue, it was a lot better for him. And like I said, I've never noticed that either, but anyone that plays really close to the bottom of the mouse or even the bottom of the pad, so if you play more up here, I feel like it's going to be not that big of a difference. But if you play with your fingers resting on the pad, if you want more stopping power, then you are definitely going to notice this bottom lip portion on the GPX. The next thing is obviously going to be the clicks. You can tell that the click design right here, this middle portion itself, is going to be separated rather than it basically touching like on the G Pro. And I have noticed that whenever buttons are more separated, they tend to feel more tactile, and I'm not too sure as to why. So although it is a different button design, I actually think that this is an improvement. And that is not to say that the GPX button design is flawed really at all. Even with Omron 20Ms in this, I still love the click feeling in the GPX, although there are obviously much better options. And the last thing would be the skates. Obviously, you can tell that the skates are massively different on both mice. In terms of stock skates, however, the GPX loses in this category. I don't know a single sane human being that is using stock GPX skates unless you just didn't pick them up or forgot that other feet existed in the world. Although you can tell that I did have to switch it. I'm using BTL skates on this mouse in particular, and these feel so much better than the stock. The stock, especially because the edges, except for down here, up here, they weren't rounded on the stock skates when I got it. So I did have to change that. Although the biggest difference between these two is going to be the weight. And is weight really that determining factor between $30 to $50? Honestly, I would say no, because I do feel like the Valor has made improvements to the G Pro that I really wish Logitech would do in general. The biggest thing I feel like is this bottom lip portion. Really the only thing I think the Valor does a lot better than the G Pro is going to be the overall weight, and then it's also going to be this bottom lip portion and the stock skates, of course. But obviously all of this can be changed with modding, or if you want to pay that extra fee. I never want to, so I'm pretty much just going to stay stock. If the GPX does just have lackluster clicks on your copy, and you want to try something that has a bit better click quality, better mouse feet quality in general, although it is going to be a bit denser, I do feel like the Valor is honestly a good pickup. If the Valor is at $100, I would much rather suggest this more than a G Pro, although you do have that Logitech reliability with a warranty, customer support, and it pretty much being available in many different places. Right now, for the PureTrak Valor, the only place I'm aware of you being able to get it is on their own site. So you will have to just go through them. But yeah, that's pretty much all for my review. And thank you so much to PureTrak for sending this out, and I hope to see you on the next one. Peace.